The age has come and gone where once directors or writers might take an IP that they loved and cared about and were very passionate about and think, now is my chance to tell this story that I love and solidify its legacy in the minds of millions and for generations to come. It's now where someone will just pick up an IP and go, now is my chance to prove how smart I am and solidify my legacy by inserting my own creativity and ideology into a world that isn't even mine for millions of dollars. Some said that it is unrealistic of me to compare The Witcher to The Lord of the Rings. And this is not an attack on anyone who said that to me. Why shouldn't we compare new works within a genre to the best works within that established genre? I also don't buy into the idea that you can't compare a TV show to a movie, especially if you're comparing the writing. But The Witcher show doesn't get a pass because it's just a TV show. The Witcher Season 1 had $10 million on average as a budget per episode. That is an $80 million budget for the entire first season. In contrast, the first season of Game of Thrones had a budget of only $60 million, and I believe they had 10 episodes. The Fellowship of the Ring alone had a budget of $93 million. And yet Weta created their own software and pioneered and perfected things that we take for granted in the movie industry today on computers that were essentially potatoes, and so they were able to create a processing system that rivaled NASA's. So I refuse to accept lower your expectations, nothing can be as good as Lord of the Rings as a response. And you should too. We should never lower our expectations or our standards based on the competence of the people who are involved or the medium through which it is presented to us. And if a person isn't right for the job, if their lack of experience or expertise or passion is bringing down what had every right to be one of the greatest fantasy shows of this decade, then those people should be fired, not defended. And we shouldn't be making excuses for them, because then people are gonna get off thinking, oh, well, we can just give them really wrinkly armor. We could just make characters act in complete opposition to their arcs for the rest of the entire show because it's just fantasy. No one really cares. No. I care. Stop it. Right, on to the topic at hand. Sorry, I got a little heated there for a second. The first thing I would do is rip off the Game of Thrones map opening, because it does multiple things at once. It gives an epic feel and it sets the mood, yes, but the most important thing is that it establishes where things are in relation to each other and what the constantly changing political geography of the world is. They had the same thing in Avatar: The Last Airbender, where at the beginning of every episode, they'd have a little bit of exposition, we would know who all of the factions are, what they wanted from each other, and we would have a picture of the map. I would change some things fairly quickly about the casting in order to help tell the story better. I would have cast different actresses to play the young sorceresses and then the sorceresses after their transformations. The changes didn't really seem magical enough. It was more like watching a slightly more fantasy version of America's Next Top Model, where everyone just got like a little bit of a makeover, and then we would be able to tell who the sorceresses transformed into based on perhaps their dialect, perhaps the type of magic that they choose to use. Certain elements of their costume design could remain through lines or just through dialogue, or better yet, just cut the whole thing altogether. I would recast Queen Calanthe, or at least direct her differently, or ask the writers to portray her differently or something. And that is not a comment on the actress herself. I don't think she did a bad job, and none of this should be taken as a comment on the actors. But she is the lioness of Sintra. Lions are noble. Lionesses protect the pride. They're cubs. They are mothers first, and yet I got hyena vibes from Calanthe in the show, especially when she was the younger Calanthe in the past. She was brazen, she was bloodthirsty, she was uncouth, she was slurring her S's as if she was drunk. Women, warriors, characters in fantasy, they can be strong queens who lust for battle and are brilliant tacticians without being made into caricatures of Gaston. So we'll talk about the factions from the first season of The Witcher, the Dryads specifically. I would have made them way more ethereal. They did not have to be so grounded in reality. They looked way more like druids than actual creatures created by magic, as if this small tribe of Amazonian warriors simply existed to just kill anybody that came into their forest and did nothing else. There was no levity at all, so we didn't want to be there because that portion of the story was boring and didn't make any sense. But also, none of the characters except for Dara seemed like they wanted to be there either. This is a delicate, raw nation of magical creatures that have their own society and they're masters of their domain. We need to be shown who these people are, aside from that they live in a forest, they have a magic tree, and that they interact with Ciri. Dwarves, we've been over this in my Witcher Rant video. My solution to this is that they should have been in heavy prosthetics or full force perspective or a combination of both. With a budget of $10 million per episode, I see no reason why we can't be applying cinematography tricks that were pioneered with less technology over 2 decades ago. I had no problem with the elves per se, you know, they were passable. I don't mind them taking a fairly grounded approach. They shouldn't be that much different from the humans. Otherwise, the juxtaposition between the humans and the elves gets lost. Nilfgaard. My solution for the armor is to give them something inspired by Lorica Segmentata, maybe a combination of Lorica and a coat of plates, something to medievalize it a little bit so it doesn't look too tied to the real world, too ancient. Give that to the infantry and then have German or Italian style blackened full plate armor for the officers, giving Lorica to the soldiers in the earlier seasons and then having them transfer up to plate as they continue to gain power is a logical and historical progression of sorts, rather than whatever it is that we got. Sintra was also fine, like the elves, they were passable for me, though I noticed that they liked giving Burgonet helmets to all of the human factions that weren't Nilfgaard, no matter who they were or where on the continent, if that was even mentioned in the first place. But Sintra to me looked fairly Greek inspired. I want to lean into that a little bit more and give them hoplite style shields, since they were already using arming swords anyway, and flair for their helmets, maybe even give them some cool spears. They already had the halberds, it would look very nice in my opinion. Some Cintrans had accents and then some did not. It is either all or nothing in my opinion, or the story needs to make it abundantly clear that Sintra is an enormous kingdom made up of many different cultures. But honestly, since Nilfgaard is the conquering force, it makes much more sense for them to be the most diverse group of people on the continent, because they are constantly adding territories to their nation that don't actually share their culture or nationality, and they're an army based off of conscription. So the Nilfgaardians should have been more diverse than everybody else. It actually makes logical sense within the world.
Nilfgaard takes no prisoners.
The Mage's Conclave, for me, was pretty well established, actually. I didn't have any complaints with the way that they were portrayed, other than that, for how much politics they were supposed to be controlling, we didn't actually learn anything about the politics of the world through any of the interactions that any of the mages had, when instead that would have been a really good time to establish some world building. Everyone instead was just reacting to external plot circumstances instead of actually having any opinions or beliefs or motives outside of an issue of what the plot dictated that they must be talking about in a specific scene. The mages that decided to fight for the North against Nilfgaard should have been introduced prior to the Battle of Sodden. And then if we had actually known who they were, maybe it would have meant a little bit more when 13 of them sacrificed themselves to defeat Nilfgaard. Now we're just gonna have a list of names. Few, if any of them, will actually mean anything to us, and instead of us actually caring about any of these characters, what we will be left with is getting to watch other characters care about these characters that we didn't know for us. Action in the first season of The Witcher, I think, is pretty universally acknowledged as being a mixed bag. Geralt had some very cool moves. He was doing pirouettes and spins, and that's good. But then we had Duny also doing pirouettes and spins, and then we had Vilgefortz jumping all over the place. So can everybody in the world fight like a Witcher? No, of course they can't. If I were in charge of everything, all the humanoid styles would be based and grounded in legitimate real-world fighting styles, with the exception of the Witchers and maybe Vilgefortz. Most importantly, I would hire a single fight director or group of fight directors just for the Witchers specifically, and then coordinate fights and move responses with the rest of the fight directors for the cast, so that the Witchers appear more skilled and flashy, and their counters to real-world techniques appear more legitimate. And then the Witcher choreographers would also work closely with the animators and also the writers, so that fights could be prepared for accordingly. Witcher signs, and potions for that matter, needed to be explained immediately to the audience. And this easily could have been done in the first episode, when Marelka is telling Geralt that she wants to become a Witcher. As they're walking, Marelka says, "Oh, Geralt, I want to become a Witcher too, so that I can travel the world and use a sword and cast magic spells." And Geralt's like, "Witchers can't cast spells." And she's like, "Well then how did you blow out all the candles at once to scare that mean barkeep?" Because that happened in my version. And then Geralt's like, "Those weren't spells, those are signs. Easier to learn." And she's like, "Oh, well, can you teach me?" And he's just like, "No." And she's like, "Well, because girls can't be witches." And that tells us a lot more information than the original version of the script, because now we know, yes, that girls can't be witchers. That's foreshadowed because they wanted to do that. But now we also know that witchers aren't wizards, and we know that signs aren't magic. And it leaves more to be explored, like what the different types of signs are, but this still tells us the basic rules of the world and what to expect from it. So it's not just completely random when Geralt uses the Force on some guys. Because signs are different than magic, we'll talk talk about magic, and magic in worlds can be explained in stories in which the magic actually needs to be explained, and we'll get to that in a second. But in this case, the magic of the world was actually explained very poorly, because the equivalent exchange thing from Full Metal Alchemist is actually a mechanic. It is not the magic system. It is not how magic works. Like, it works in Full Metal Alchemist because one of the first themes is that alchemy is a science, but that the measure of a human soul can't be explained via measurements. So matter cannot be created or destroyed, but it can be remade into other equivalent things. So how is this rock being lifted? Is it just sheer willpower and telekinesis at the cost of the life of a flower for some reason? Or is it actual magic that the sorcerers are conjuring and controlling because they paid the toll of the cost of a flower for some reason? Introducing these as concepts creates far more questions than is necessary than just telling us magic exists in this world. Ultimately, magic in The Witcher doesn't need to be explained because it's not really a plot point unless you make it one. But having Deus Ex Machina moments in The Witcher is fine, not from a writing perspective, but from a character narrative perspective, because these sorceresses are already established to be incredibly powerful beings. The way around moments like this feeling cheap or unearned is not to introduce arbitrary laws that don't really even get followed half of the time to increase suspense, but to write how spells are used thoughtfully and foreshadow them with just a little bit of foresight, maybe even an episode or two in advance. Basic scene structure is that there is something that a character wants, there is an obstacle, and that the character must overcome this obstacle using various tactics. Currently, as it is, it's as if using magic is in itself the obstacle, not the tactic by which characters overcome an actual obstacle. And this is what we in the acting industry tend to call playing the obstacle rather than playing the objective, where in which the action of the scene is not that I'm actually trying to achieve something, but rather that I'm like struggling to open this door. It's a much stronger thing to watch a character struggle with a moral dilemma, or a group of people, or the tactic of another character. It is the circumstance that requires the magic that tells a compelling story, not the actual casting of the magic itself. Any well-written story can prevent cheap moments, no matter what the magic system is. But no magic system can save a plot that is written thoughtlessly. All locational changes needed to be made explicitly, either with a title screen or with dialogue that was specifically expository, like in Lord of the Rings. They arrive in Rohan, and literally the first thing that happens is we hear the Rohan theme play, we see what the terrain of Rohan looks like, and then Aragorn says, "Rohan, realm of the Horse Lords," and then now we know where we are. Conversely, you have a shot, we see Sintra, and then it just says Sintra, year, and that would have also helped make jumping through time a lot easier to understand. But instead, they didn't even tell us that we were jumping through time. Everything had to be picked up in script-based context clues. We just see Sintra, and then we have to wait a little bit, and then maybe if we're lucky, a guard says, "And in Sintra, we do this." And I'm like, oh, okay, cool, we're in Sintra. Where is that? And the fact that we've jumped timelines isn't even addressed. If they just told us, this is how we're going to tell the story, you can still be confused by the story, but at least you won't be confused by how we're telling it, because it's very dumb to do that. The entire first season should have been seen through Geralt's eyes and focused mostly on Geralt. If we're jumping locations, each one of those stories within the episode should be strategically placed to bring us to different parts of the world and then introduce those parts of the world and the territories and the factions to the viewer with each episode. Every character introduction should have been the same as Triss's or Jaskier's, where we don't meet them until Geralt meets them. And then maybe if it's necessary, we get a little bit of backstory afterwards. But including sad or really any backstory just because you think it's interesting first before we even know who the person is or what they believe presupposes that it is the history of a character that makes us care about that character, but that is not the case. We care about the histories of characters that we already care about because they were well written and relatable characters independent of whatever it is that happened to them first. When you meet a person for the first time and you think to yourself, I'd like to be friends with this person, or I would like to ask this person on a date, do you know everything about that person? Do you ask that person for a biography of their entire life before you decide whether or not they're worth your time? Or do you generally make a split-second assessment of this person and then gradually get to know them over the course of your relationship? So the first time we meet Yen should be in The Last Wish, and we are just left to wonder, wow, who is this very rude but yet very clearly powerful sorceress, and why is Geralt crushing on her so hard? It's way more impactful in this case if then we find out what Yennefer's past was, that she used to be a hunchback. But as it is now, we know that Yennefer was a hunchback, but Geralt doesn't. So if he finds out, when he finds out, I'm not really going to care. All I'm going to be able to do is watch Geralt struggle with receiving information that I already had. All of the dramatic information has already been given to us up front. We are robbed of identifying with the characters organically and instead encouraged to sympathize with them because they are feeling emotions that we are privy to because of our omnipotent point of view. It cheapens the performance, and it also requires less intelligent writing because there's no nuance. If you've ever watched anything and the emotions that you feel while you're watching a scene are clearly not what the scene itself is attempting to get you to feel, it's not necessarily because the story concept was boring, it's because the writers didn't do a good job. They didn't lead you to the cathartic, emotional response that you were supposed to have, but instead just went for the cheap, listen, main characters are sad now. There's sad music playing, you are supposed to be sad. This is what I mean when the script dictates that there are moments where the audience is supposed to applaud or feel an emotion. It doesn't actually lead you there, it just tells you that this is what you're supposed to feel. And in this case, it isn't the fault of the actors, and based on the interviews of the writers and the showrunners that I've seen, they understand the difference between this, and they know that Andrzej very successfully wrote the intelligent and complex and compelling version of the story, and they clearly wanted to emulate this. But the way that the first season is structured necessitates that the audience is alienated from the telling of the story. The characters have tons of information about the world that we as the viewer do not have, and we as the viewers have tons of information about the histories of the characters that they do not have about each other. And it is this resulting disconnect that inevitably is going to lead to these problems in the future. Problems that could have easily been solved from the start had we been shown the world of The Witcher through one point of view at the very start and then expanded afterwards. And it's almost as if the first two books in the series, which the first season is supposed to be based on, The Last Witch and The Sword of Destiny, focus mostly on Geralt, maybe for this very reason. My fellow adventurers, thank you for coming to my TED Talk. I will see you next week with another video, and in the meantime, I'd like to wish you good luck on your adventures.